what we wanted to talk about today, and what I was particularly excited for, is the William Nylander contract extension. And Case, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this, but before I pass it to you, I'll just read the very basics. 8 years, $11.5 million AAV for $92 million total. Nylander will be 28 when the deal kicks in. He'll be 36 when it's done. It's 13.7% of the cap this year because the cap's $83.5 million. Next year, when it actually kicks in the very first year of the deal, it's 13.1% of the cap, as the cap is expected to raise to $87.7 million. So, Case, what were your thoughts on the deal? Did you ever think that Nylander was getting traded or that this deal wasn't going to get done? What are your general thoughts on it?
I personally did not think that Nylander was going anywhere. I thought that if anything, they were going to ship someone else out because Nylander has been kind of consistently the best player on the Leafs this year. I mean, Matthews has in spurts been way better, but he also disappeared early on in the year and etc. Anyways, Nylander's been the guy so far. He was also one of their best players in the playoffs last year, if not the best player for the playoffs. And I just think that they needed to keep him around. They needed to keep the core four around, and they had to pay him because his number is only increasing as this year goes on. It makes a lot more sense now that I hear you say it's 13.1% of the cap next year, because then that matches Marner and you're not, pissing anyone off there except for maybe, Tyler Bertuzzi or Domi or any of the other guys who are sitting there wondering how they're ever going to get paid now. So I'm not looking at it like this is a bad move or a good move. All I wonder is what is the future going to hold for this team? Because this has some pretty big implications on this team.
It really does. And I feel like that's the question on everyone's mind. Like, what is this team going to look like after next season when Nylander's new deal kicks in, Matthews' new deal has kicked in for a year, and then JT and Mitch Marner are both up? What's going to happen then? So it's a bold decision by Brad Treliving to sign this deal. We know he loves his long-term, high dollar amount deals. He's done a few of those, some good, some bad. But it's a bold decision here. And I think from what it sounds like, from just listening to different podcasts and reading different articles from some of the big insiders, it seems like the main reasoning was for getting this deal done right now instead of waiting until the end of the season was just to have some cap certainty going forward so that they can make a move at the deadline. So I liked it for that reason. But in terms of the dollar amount, going into this season, the comparables were pretty clear, right? It was Timo Meier. He signed that deal and their production was pretty similar. Sebastian Aho, I think most people would argue that at the time, Aho was a better player and is also a centerman, whereas Nylander's a winger. So those were the two comparables. And very quickly, after a really great start to the season, William Nylander and his camp laughed all the way to the bank because he's on pace for 120 points. He's having a career year. And all of a sudden, that number went from around, starting in the high eights, I think the Leafs wanted to start, all the way to 11.5, which personally, even though I am a Nylander truther and stan, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, they started pointing their fingers at Pastrnak pretty quick after the start of the season, saying that's the guy you should start comparing us to.
Yeah, which is interesting too, because when you look at Pasternak's deal, 11.25 on a long-term deal in Boston, when he signed it, it's almost identical in terms of percentage of the cap. So then you start to have this conversation with Nylander going forward, that's the kind of production you're going to expect the year that he's on pace to have right now, 120 points. I don't think he's necessarily going to score 60 plus like Pastrnak does or did the 1 year, but I don't know, man. It gets pretty tricky because expectations go sky high when you make that much money.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe if we want to move to what we expect the future to look like for this team,
sure.
Because I don't think either of us are going to argue that Nylander didn't deserve this money. Like, the guy's been phenomenal. So my questions start to become, what happens to Tavares in the future? What's his contract going to look like when it's up? What is Marner's at the same time coming up look like? And then you've got, there's a ton of players that this is their final year. And then next year, there's a ton of players in their final year. So there's a lot changing in this team. And I'm curious to see what these contracts are going to look like. I also think that next year could be a fucking ridiculous year for this team because Marner is going to be in that contract year playing out his ass, trying to get, you know, more like 13.9% of the cap next year. And Tavares is going to be up. So I don't think he's going to be looking to play himself into a bigger contract, obviously, but it's still, he's still going to be pushing. And then like a guy like Matthew Nyes is also going to be up. So I think that a lot of these guys are going to be playing out their asses next year and new contracts are kicking in. Everyone's feeling good. If they can put together a few bottom six players and defensemen who just kind of bump and grind and are enough to get by, like, I don't know, this team could get scary if they finally figure out a goalie.
That's interesting that you say that, actually, because I was doing some math and I'll go through it here for you. But just to start, like surface level, it's interesting that you say next year could be the year, because next year will actually be the season where the top four forwards will be taking up the most amount of cap space combined, just because the Matthews and the Nylander deals kick in, and then Tavares and Mitch are still on their current deals. And this is by projections, by the way. Like, who knows? The following year it could be more. But this was some of the math that I did. So we know that the cap is going up $4.5 million next season. That's what Gary Bettman said in a press conference about, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago or so. And it's all but confirmed, right? Or it might actually be confirmed, but we're not exactly sure until we see it on Cap Friendly, at the start of next season. So we'll err on the side of caution for that. But $4.5 million is what it's expected to go up. The Leafs spent about $6.2 million between Nylander and Matthews getting their extensions done. So between those two players, they're spending an additional $6.2 million. That's because Matthews goes from 11.634 up to 13.25, and Nylander goes from about 6.9 up to this new 11.5. So they're spending a little bit more than the cap increase, which is a little bit tough. But like we were talking about, after next season, Mitch and JT are both up. Their contracts are finished. So I was thinking that John Tavares could get a similar deal to Anze Kopitar, who got 2 years, $7 million AAV. When he signed that, he was 36. So maybe a little extra term for JT, maybe an extra million or $2. I think that would be reasonable. And then it seems like the Leafs have already kind of set their salary cap expectations for Mitch. If they want to keep him, it's going to be more than Willie and less than Matthews. And you can't argue any more than Matthews. And if you're the player, it starts with Nylander's number and increases from there. So I think a reasonable deal for him, and this is all just, thinking ahead to the future, could be something like $12.5 million. So the season after that, and stay with me here because there's just a little bit more math, but I'm almost done. The season after that, so 25-26, the cap on Cap Friendly is projected to go up to about $92 million. That would be a $4.3 million increase. So this would mean that if JT got $8 million, Mitch got $12.5, then the top four players on the team, the big four forwards, in terms of percentage of the cap, would be taking up 49%. Okay. This year, it's 48%. It's essentially the same thing. But then next year, and I already alluded to this, with those big four tickets on the cap, it'll be about 53%. So an additional 4%. So that's just some math there. Next year is where I think it's going to hurt them the most. But then going forward, so long as the cap continues to go up and there's not a worldwide event that shuts down sports and prevents the cap from going up a reasonable amount each year, it should be smooth sailing, or at least the same level of sailing as they are right now. You can argue if that's bad or not, but they've been a pretty good regular season team with those four guys.
Yeah, and when I'm looking at next year and I say that I'm interested to see how how they fare and if that's going to be the year we've been talking about for 10 years now. It's more about guys being in their contract years and wondering, if Nylander comes back a bit and is 100-point guy still, and Matthews is still scoring around 60, and then Marner ups his game on top of that because he's in a contract year. John Tavares does the same. Matthew Nyes does the same. It's like, I just wonder what that looks like. And it's kind of like an optimistic look at it. But I mean, the narrative that everyone's been preaching, if you're not a Leafs fan, is how is this team going to win when they're paying 4 guys so much? And if it's going to be 50, did you say 53?
53.
That's a lot.
That's the highest. That's the highest.
They're really going to have to rely on some entry-level contracts kicking in, if that's Minton or Cowan, if he's ready, or the Finnish
Niemela
defenseman. That's it.
Yeah.
A few of these guys are going to have to step up, or you're going to have to find more of those. I hate speaking it, but the hometown discount. Oh. Everyone saying that. If I hear that one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. And it's funny, we were talking. I was talking to Luke about this deal earlier today, and he mentioned John Tavares and if he's going to take a hometown discount, and then I compared him to Kopitar, like you did, saying $7 million at 2 years makes more sense.
That's an easy comparable, right?
They're very comparable in play style, so it makes a lot of sense there. And the fact that they're both the captains of the team, they've been around a while now, and he mentioned similar comparables, but the hometown discount advantage. And I said, Kopitar has been living in LA as long as he's ever lived in Slovenia.
Yep.
He is now 36 years old. So I don't know. I think that is his hometown, and he took a hometown discount maybe. So it's just funny. You see the comments everywhere talking about hometown discounts. What is Domi going to do? Is he going to expect a raise? Is he going to take a haircut? Is he, what's going to happen? And same as Giordano, can he get another year in and $850K? And I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how it works out. I like the math approach you have there, that all things considered, looking at the cap percentage, if it works out that way and it's only 49% in the future, and they have a few of these entry level contracts kick in, then I don't know. Looks good to me.
I think the concern with that is then, there are some good players coming up who also need to be signed. You mentioned Tyler Bertuzzi, who knows if they try to keep him around, Max Domi, but then also players like Nyes and Minton will eventually need a contract. Timothy Liljegren, underratedly, will need to get paid if they want to keep him on the back end. He's been really solid for them this year, especially since coming back from that Marchand injury that he sustained when he skated by the bench and Bertuzzi was laughing and not defending his own team. But anyways, we don't talk about that. But I just wanted to look into the numbers here, because it all comes down to percentage of the cap. And as long as the cap keeps coming up, so will player salaries. And going back to those numbers, I projected Tavares to sign for about $8 million and Marner to sign for about 12.5. Who knows, right? Like, Tavares could be a $5 million player at that point, and then they need to bring in another center to replace him. Like, we just don't know because it's in the future. I'm not predicting that. I think he'll be around an $8 million second line center guy, but who knows, right? And, maybe Marner turns into a 130-point player. Maybe he's an 80-point player. So there's a lot of hockey to be played before either of those deals are signed and before we can start predicting what the cap is going to look like. But just wrapping up on the Nylander talk, I just wanted to put it to you and see if you have a grade on the contract.
I'd give the contract maybe an A-. I think that when in the grand scheme of things, like value wise, the value's there. He might deserve maybe a little closer to the 11 million mark, around a Pasternak, just below Pasternak. And the only reason I don't give it an A+ because this team needed to find some extra money. So for the team's sake, it's maybe a B+, but for Willie Nylander, I mean, A++. So that's my grade on it. But just quickly, I wanted to kind of mention another thing Luke said is that, a guy like Tyler Bertuzzi, it's all going to be up to the playoffs. That's what his contract's going to determine. Is another team going to steal him for $5-6 million because of how he plays in the playoffs? But to me, if you're not one of the core four, the only thing that matters is how you play in the playoffs for this team for your contract next year. I think that's going to be the benchmark for every single one of them, even Liljegren. It's like, if you perform in the playoffs, you can expect more, because that's what's going to matter for these guys going forward. And, there's a revolving door of $1 million guys that want to play in Toronto and can play in a bottom six. So if you can perform in the playoffs, that's how you're going to get, the portion of the 47% remaining.
Yeah. And let's be honest, it would be nice to have depth players in Toronto who make a little more money, who have a little bit more responsibility. But, it's a salary cap problem because it's a triple hard cap league, and that's just the way it is. But, at the end of the day, it's a pretty good problem to have. Toronto just ended up drafting 3 really, really solid superstar players, which a lot of teams can't really say. So, you hear all the talk. There's a lot of Leafs hate out there, but, you drafted Matthews, you drafted Nylander, you drafted Marner. All 3 of those guys are pretty damn good. You can argue maybe you shouldn't have signed Tavares, but that's revisionist history at this point, right? We all knew that the deal wasn't going to look great by the end of it, and we all knew that he was also offered $13 million by San Jose at the time. So I don't know. I think it's revisionist history to say things like that. But just I think it's a good problem to have, and they'll eventually figure it out as long as the cap keeps going up. Personally, I gave it a B+. I thought the deal was fine. It was clearly a little bit of an overpay. And I think that's safe to say when you just look around the league and you look at the types of players who are the most comparable to William Nylander in terms of their career production. They don't make $11.5 million. Some of them make, 10 plus, but it's just the price that they had to pay given the fact they had almost zero leverage in Toronto. Like, they wanted to get this done. They made it very clear they wanted to get this done, and they wanted to get it done as soon as possible so they can make a deal at the deadline as well. So it just is what it is, right? Like, I'm happy it's done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Hopefully he gets a nice little contract boost like most players do after they sign a big ticket. They kind of go off a little bit, which is nice. Hopefully he gets that. But at the end of the day, and I think this was on 32 Thoughts they were talking about, the Maple Leafs were trying to find a trade partner for Nylander to upgrade the defense, or to trade someone else so that they could fit Nylander in and upgrade the team in a different way. But in terms of money in, money out for this season on a team who is competing, it just doesn't make sense. Those players aren't available. And that's
you're going to trim Nylander's $6.9 million contract when he's playing like this.
Exactly.
Like, they still are trying to win a cup this year. Like, you got to remember that.
And so that's what they concluded. It just didn't make sense. Those types of players who are good enough to replace William Nylander aren't out there. And, it is what it is. And some other, something else, and I know we're trying to wrap up on the Nylander talk, but something else we have to consider too is, certain states and all of the provinces have a tax issue, which is very clearly a problem for some NHL teams. The tax in Ontario is far more than it is in a no state tax state like Florida or Texas. California and New York are complaining a little bit here too, but it's just the nature of what it is, right? So I heard
at least you get to live in California and New York.
yeah, exactly. But I heard this. It was Sebastian Aho, who makes, I think, just a little bit less than 10 on his new deal. I forget exactly what the number is, but someone said that after taxes, he'll be bringing in more US dollars per year than Nylander will be, making 11.5.
I remember, and this stat will never leave my head, is when the Steven Stamkos talks came up about him potentially coming to sign in Toronto, and he signed for 8.5 in Tampa.
Something.
It was for him to make it as much in Toronto as he would on that 8.5 contract in Tampa, he'd have to get paid $12 million by Toronto. So it's just
back then too.
Yeah, back then.
Then. Yeah, it's interesting, man. Like, I think there needs to be an equalizer for that kind of stuff, but of course, that's well above what we're going to discuss on the podcast.
And then there's the whole discussion, though, of like Willie Nylander is going to be on every single poster in Toronto and is going to be riding the subway in Scotiabank commercials and whatever, the TTC commercials. So he's going to be making a lot of money.
Absolutely. Good point. Nick Kyprios was talking about this yesterday on his show with Justin Bourne. Good point. But the problem is that takes time and effort. So you have to work for that kind of stuff too. It doesn't just... like, not that it's that much work to sit on the subway and send some text messages and look good on camera, but it is what it is. You still have to go out and do it.
You have to take a couple pictures and do a couple video takes, but like, I bet you without raising a finger, a lot more people know about Willie Nylander in Toronto than Sebastian Aho in Carolina and Raleigh.
Yeah, very true. Okay, final point on Nylander, and it's actually a question to you. Now that Willie, starting next year, will be making $11.5 million per season, that ties him for the 5th highest paid player in the entire NHL with Erik Karlsson. If today, and this was Frank Saravalli who posed the same question, I just thought it was so great, I wanted to ask you. If today all 32 teams had a fantasy draft and had to rebuild their team from scratch, how high does William Nylander go? If he's paid the 5th highest, he should be the 5th best player, right? That's the argument. So I wanted to see where you think he would go.
Well, you got to remember that there's some pretty ridiculous contracts out there, and if you're going to build a team, you gotta factor in youth. There's a bunch of young players that are going to get picked first, and then there's the bargain contracts that are going to get picked. So I think Nylander still falls pretty deep because of that.
How about contracts aside, though? Like contracts aside, just who do you like? Do you think he's a top 5 player in the league? Obviously not. But top 10, top 20, top 30, first rounder is the question. Like, where exactly?
He's a first rounder. Yeah, I think he's around 25, maybe. Like, if I don't know, 20th. Like, I'd have to sit down and really think about this. I know. Like, it's been a while since I've ranked every player.
Yeah.
But just off the top of my head, I'd expect him to fall somewhere between the 20 to 25 mark. I don't know. I think I'm still factoring in contracts in my head there.
It's hard though. It's hard. And that's the point, right? Like,
do you build a team with a winger? That's the thing. Like,
that's also true.
There's centers and defensemen that I'd rather take.
That's also true. I just thought it was an interesting question, especially because he's now the 5th highest paid player in the league, which is crazy, but it's the way things go. And we've both said we're not too concerned about that going forward.